Sometimes a year can seem to be an extremely long period of time, and often athletes and coaches will avoid even thinking that far ahead, let alone planning. However, when you consider that a year is only 4 12-week-long training cycles, the time shrinks considerably. Planning a year out doesn't need to be in great detail, and I don't think there's any good reason for it to be. The purpose of planning on the year scale is primarily to schedule macro cycles according to the competition schedule, and secondarily to create general goals and therefore a focus for each macro cycle, which will guide our program design. The first step in scheduling is selecting the most important competitions for the year. These will vary among athletes depending on their level of competition. For the beginning and intermediate lifter, competitions will be of the local and possibly regional variety, meaning scheduling can be less predictable and may not even be known as far out as a year, preventing a detailed plan for the year to be created early on. However, at this level, it's way less important anyway, so it's not really a problem to just have a very broad idea of a plan rather than actual dates. Additionally, all meets at the local level are essentially of equal importance, so it may not be necessary to prioritize. An exception is if a lifter wants to do multiple meets in a brief period of time, such as 3 to 4 weeks apart. In this case, it makes sense to select certain meets in that period to prioritize for more effective macro cycle durations that include the low priority meets as just heavy training days and a funny outfit. Lifters at this level will generally be working with relatively short macro cycles and will be making relatively rapid progress, making it possible to peak for a greater number of competitions in a year. These lifters' years can be broken into as many macro cycles as there are competitions, and potentially more if there are unusually long periods without an available competition. For example, if a lifter competes in 6 meets in a year, there would be 6 macro cycles averaging 8 to 9 weeks each, although ranging in duration dependent on the actual competition calendar. If, however, there were a 3-month break between meets at some point, it may make sense with a newer lifter to break that into 2 6-week macro cycles rather than a single 12-week macro cycle. For lifters competing at the national or international level, true competition peaking will need to be limited within a year. Typically, these lifters will really peak for no more than 2 to 3 meets a year and will train through other competitions. That is, simply compete during the cycle without altering the program in any significant way to prepare for the meet. These insignificant meets will be used simply as competition experience, to help the athlete's composure, practice of the meet routine, or to experiment with higher openers or attempts in a risk-free situation. These lifters will select the most significant competitions for the year. For the U.S. national level lifter, for example, this will usually be the national championships and the American Open. For the international lifter, this would be the continental and world championships and maybe a national meet, especially if needed for ranking. The training in the year will then be scheduled around these dates so that the lifter will achieve peak performance for these competitions. Small alterations may be made to the program in the week of an insignificant meet if it won't negatively affect the macro cycle, such as changing the timing of a deload week to lead into a meet. So let's look at an example year plan for a U.S. national lifter who will be competing at the national championships and the American Open. To be clear, you absolutely do not need to lay out some fancy document like this. This is just to make it easier to understand here. Making some simple notes with dates is more than adequate. So you'll see here a full year laid out minus a week or 2 in between the national championships and that first macro cycle as we're coming around for the second iteration. But so our national championships is our primary. That's the most important competition. The American Open is secondary. That's the second most important competition. And you can kind of see how the 2 cycles, the duration of them is set accordingly, right? We're putting a little bit more time into that national championships because we want to push that actual competition shape a little bit better than we need to in the American Open. So let's say we're coming off last year's national championships, at the end of June or whatever it is. So we're going to do an initial macro cycle that's relatively short, and that's focusing on kind of capacity, dialing in some technique that we've noticed needs fixing over the past season, and just building strength, right? So it's not GPP, like we're not having them doing sprints and jumps and flips and twirlies and all that kind of stuff. This is weightlifting training, but it's a bit more general, more variety, that sort of thing, more focused on volume, strength, all that good stuff. So that's 8 weeks. At the end of that 8 weeks, we might have a testing week where maybe we're, testing squat, push press. If we go really crazy, maybe even some kind of pull variation. And then we're going to have a transition week after that. And the transition week is basically a rest week, a deload week. But the way I like to set that up is that rather than being a lighter, easier version of the previous macro cycle. It is a lighter, easier version of the next macro cycle. So we are transitioning to those new exercises and that new week structure to prepare the lifter while also allowing them to recover from the demands of that previous macro cycle. So after that, we would go into this 12-week macro cycle for the American Open. So we've gotten that strength work, that technique work, and we're going to continue that stuff, obviously, but we're going to start moving into more snatch, clean, and jerk focused work as we progress through the 3 mesocycles here, which you can see we've got a perfect 12-week cycle, so we can have 3 4-week long mesocycles. And I'll talk about in a future video how we're actually manipulating the volume and intensity week to week in these, because there are a lot of options and it depends exactly on the athlete and what you're doing with that mesocycle and macro cycle and all that fun stuff. So you'll see the difference here at the end of this macro cycle. We have a rest week, then a transition week. So more often than not, I will give an athlete what I call ladies' choice week after a competition. And that is a week where I want them to only go into the gym maybe 2 or 3 days to do whatever they feel like, as long as it is easy, different from what they've been doing, and fun. So this is a time for them to rest physically and mentally, right? To get a break from like the really, really hard push they've been doing for this competition while still staying active, which is going to help them recover. Then after that rest week, we would go into that transition week I described before, leading into the next macro cycle. And so in this example here, we have a lifter doing this 3rd macro cycle as a leg strength emphasis. So this is a lifter who, among other things, but really needs to push leg strength. We need to get those squat numbers up in order to drive bigger snatch and clean and jerk for the next competition phase. So we've got, just based on how the calendar works out, we've got 10 weeks here plus a transition week, so 11 weeks. So we can split that into 2 mesocycles. We could do that differently too. Like, we could have one slightly longer mesocycle and then a slightly shorter mesocycle. It just kind of depends on what exactly we're trying to get to. And then again, at the end of that, we probably have a testing week for the back squat, for the front squat, sometimes for both, maybe staggered a week or 2. In any case, the overwhelming focus for that macro cycle is leg strength. And obviously we're still doing plenty of snatch and clean and jerk work. We're just not emphasizing it as much. Then after that transition week, we have this 16-week cycle leading into the national championships. So this gives us a ton of time to build up to absolute best possible competition peak shape for this weightlifting season, which, at least in the US, for a national level lifter, that's kind of how we look at this, is the national championships is the end of the season. And then the American Open is kind of the first big meet in the new season. But this allows us a ton of time here to prepare for this meet. And you'll see also in the American Open cycle and during in the national championship cycle, there's a couple little meets in there. And these would just be local meets that the lifter wants to do or needs to do for, mental reasons, to build confidence, to get more practice if they're relatively new to these things. And we're choosing those based on the appropriateness of the timing, right? If there was a local meet 2 weeks out from the national championships, we're not going to do that. It's not good timing. 4 weeks and more, we're probably good. Like in this American Open cycle, we have one on week 8. So basically, 4 weeks out. The lifter's going to be in good enough competition shape that we can probably do some pretty big snatches and clean and jerks, which is going to allow them to push those numbers, to build confidence, to practice certain numbers, those sorts of things. But it's not so close to the real important competition that it's going to be disruptive. So this kind of layout is not something you necessarily have to do with every lifter. It is something I would very much recommend you do, at least really informally and with basic dates and layouts here, so that as you are going along riding these training cycles, you don't get caught up focusing on, this 1, 2, 3 weeks at a time and forget that there's a meet coming up all of a sudden and have to make this last minute scramble to try to adjust your program and lie to your athlete and pretend that this was the plan all along. Don't worry, I absolutely know what I'm doing. So always having this kind of schedule to refer back to while you are writing programming, and then to put into your notes at the beginning of each new macro cycle is going to be extremely helpful and keep you on track.